And now we're getting somewhere with this, right? Now we're getting to some explanation. I mean, we've gotten it before, but this was just very eye-opening to me. We can get through this book together. Okay. Hello, Sofa Squad, and welcome back to the sofa. Sofa's somewhere back there. I'm right here. My name's Paul if you're new to the channel, and if you're not new to the channel, my name still is Paul. Today we're going to be continuing on with our reading of Visions of Glory, and we're just going to kind of jump back in. If you caught the last installment, I basically just ended it because it was like there wasn't a different section. It just kept going and going, and I was like, I can't be doing all this. Okay. Now, what we are doing, if you're just joining this, probably like part 12 or whatever, we're getting through this book. My body has rejected it. It's incredibly painful to get through, but it is what it is. But it also is giving us some insight into the way that Lori Daybell, Chad Daybell, Jody Hildenbrand, Ruby Franke, these people thought, right? This had them in a chokehold. That's what I keep saying. We're trying to decide why did this book have a chokehold on these people by reading it and just seeing what it's about. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're here for. I will probably get through just a little bit and then we'll keep going. We are a little more than halfway through. Anyways, now remember, the big thing here is like where we left off at. The dude's, he's reincarnated, he's dying multiple lives. He's flying through the universe. He's looking down on himself. He's like, hey Jupiter. Hey Uranus, it's good to see you again. And doing all those things, okay? And coming back and just reporting on it, right? So far we've gathered, you can see why like a narcissistic person like maybe Chad or Lori and them would like love this. Okay, anyways, here we go. All of this water drained into the Great Salt Lake, moving the salted water in a tidal wave out into the desert northwest of the lake. The lake was at least twice the size that it is now and had risen about 12 feet in depth. Low-lying farms and homes were gone. In some places, water was covering I-15. The whole airport area was flooded, and it was months before military planes could land there. I don't believe commercial air services were ever restored. Most of the inhabitants of the area generally did not believe that this was a sign of the coming of Christ. They just considered it a natural disaster. Imagine that. I mean, come on. A strong core group continued to listen to the Holy Spirit and to believe and correctly interpret the signs we were seeing. But there were many, both in church and out of the church, who were angry, were despairing, and had little hope. The leadership of the church was stricken just as hard as the general population, and since all communication was down, it was several weeks before we heard anything from the official lines of the church. Those members of the 12 and other quorums who had been away on assignment were cut off by the collapse of communication worldwide. The first thing we knew of the church was that some of the food we received from the foreign troops was marked with the church logo. This comforted us, but it was still weeks before we were assured that the church leadership and its local and international organization had not collapsed altogether. We didn't know if the prophet or any of the 12 had survived. This scared many people and prompted some to stand up to try to reorganize the church according to their own ideas. Those who had the Spirit knew that the process of rebuilding the church and restoring the quorums of the priesthood was underway, but we knew almost no details. The church's organization was hampered initially by not knowing who had survived there in Salt Lake City and across the globe. Without the voice of the prophet among us, a feeling of discord and strife grew in the church. People grew angry about almost everything, and some were selfish with the remaining resources. However, many were stalwart and faithful through all of this discord and strife. The local churches of denominations, including stakes and wards, rose to the occasion, organizing relief efforts among their people, housing and feeding people, providing comfort and safety. The church had a prominent role in the rebuilding effort because the church and her people were so well prepared. But every other church joined in a united effort. I was among those who went door to door, digging out the survivors and burying the dead. Sometimes we were moved upon to give priesthood blessings, and those who had faith were saved, some with miraculous recoveries, but mostly we buried the dead and brought food and water for those who were without means. I was actually amazed at how many good Latter-day Saints had little or no food storage. We didn't judge them. Those with faith who had stored food gave it away freely and joined the the work of saving those who suffered and of preparing for the fast approaching winter. We rushed to close in the damaged homes and to find a means of heating the homes. We took materials from damaged homes to repair the standing ones. Many families moved in together into one home. It was a Herculean effort. About this time, a large column of military vehicles arrived in town, and they had come to help. They wore blue helmets and had international insignias on their doors, helmets, and uniforms. Our local civic leader had tried to organize relief efforts, but that effort expired when the foreign troops took over. Only the church and our Christian friends remained organized and committed. The foreign troops were from many nations. Many groups didn't speak English at all. There were groups who looked Asian. We couldn't tell from their language or from their uniforms because they were all dressed alike. There were troops from European counties as well, but none from England that I met. There were also American service people from what remained in the U.S. Armed Forces, depending upon their rank. They were sometimes the leaders of the divisions. Most of the time, they were not. They came in large, strange-looking trucks, much larger than those of our present military. Some of the trucks had 4 or 5 driven axles and were too wide to drive down a single lane of highway. They had come from the west coast of California and made their way across a large area of devastation. Their vehicles were covered in mud and showed evidence of harsh use, but seemed rugged and reliable. The trucks were loaded with a great deal of cargo, food, medical supplies, fuel, and other necessities. We were grateful to see them arrive, but it was unsettling just the same. They took over several schools as their headquarters and used the gymnasium to store goods, which they guarded closely. They also set up hospitals with real doctors. They were soon overwhelmed by the injured. Those of us who were uninjured volunteered to help with the work. They were surprised by how many came to help. They gave us gloves and coats and welcomed us. They found heavy equipment and soon began digging large graves in the schoolyards. There were many former missionaries among us, so we were able to communicate with these new arrivals to some extent. They informed us that much of Europe, Asia, and Africa had been spared from the major effects of the earthquakes and tidal waves. Most of the devastation had occurred in North and South America. They said that they had arrived in California in hundreds of ships and had immediately worked with those people to stabilize things, and then they had headed east. They told us that a large relief effort had landed on the East Coast and was working west. We learned that every major city that they had come to was devastated. They reported, as I had seen during my flyover vision, remember we're going like, hey there everybody. So that's like the vibe here, right? They reported, as I had seen during my flyover vision, that California coastline had broken off into a series of islands. Now, I remember that if you watched last video, I told you as soon as they were talking about this, I was like, I can 100% tell you they're going to say California went away or whatever, right? And then sure enough, they also told us that more troops and supplies were on the way from all over the world. They said to us, America has always been generous to us in disaster relief, and now it is our turn to respond. They seemed genuine in their desire to help, but I could not see light in their faces, and I deeply distrusted their long-term objectives. I think most of us felt that way. Not many days after they arrived, they began clearing the streets of rubble and overturned cars so that relief efforts could move more efficiently south. I was on one of the first big trucks when we headed south to see how far we could get beyond Salt Lake City and what relief efforts were needed there. Initially, the foreigners, and especially the few American servicemen in their ranks, were impressed with what the church had accomplished. They said that no other city they had encountered so far had done so much or was better prepared for a disaster of this magnitude. These new troops were a great asset to us in our efforts to recover. They didn't take long to get organized and soon had relief teams going up and down streets, providing necessary assistance to the citizens. Troops also left from Salt Lake City to continue south into the Utah Valley area, which was also hit hard by the earthquakes, but had experienced only minor localized flooding when reservoirs had failed. The local relief workers joined with various groups of these foreign troops. We worked with them and rode in their vehicles to and from assignments. We worked our way down the side streets, through the residential areas, approaching Immigration Canyon. We stopped at every home to assist people, promising that other rescuers were close behind us. We were still in the residential area a few miles from the point of the mountain when I realized that the view looked wrong. There were no more trees or power poles to be seen toward the south. We slowed down and approached with caution. We could not believe our eyes. Ahead of us, the ground had fallen away. I walked up to the edge and peered down into the hole. I'm guessing the land beyond had fallen 50 feet or more. The area below was underwater with total destruction. Nothing had survived that we could see. We stood there pondering for a long time until the military leader told us it was time to leave. We backed away and turned around. The sun was just setting in the most beautiful sunset I have ever seen. The atmosphere was filled with dust, and it made the deepest reds and oranges imaginable. We were just pulling away when a hypothesis formed in my mind. The earthquake had not been centered in downtown Salt Lake City, but here where this land had dropped away. Apparently it had been overarching a massive underground lake. There is a major fault that runs right along the base of the mountain, and lesser faults that fracture out perpendicular to that. Apparently one of these east-west fractures had given way and dropped this landmass into the underground lake. With no place to go but up, the water had followed earthquake fissures and then storm drains until it gushed up into the sky inside the city. I'm not sure if this is actually what happened, but it is one possible explanation for the water coming from underground. This fallen area eventually formed a new freshwater lake that emptied into the Jordan River and then into the Great Salt Lake, which was now filled with fresh water. It took a couple of weeks for the water to drain out of the city. We continually followed the water's receding edge, bringing relief efforts and burying the dead. When we could finally see the Salt Lake Temple and the conference center, we found that the temple had been flooded about 20 feet deep up to the round windows. It was still majestic and solid. The old tabernacle was gone. Only a foundation and a few timbers remained. The Joseph Smith Memorial Building and church office buildings were still standing, but there was water damage on the lower floors. The conference center had survived, with little more damage than flooding of the parking areas and lower rooms. The main audience had flooded partially, but most of it was easily salvaged. The flood receded quickly enough that nobody was stuck in the taller buildings more than a few days. Okay, next is going to be a devastating plague. Nice little bedtime story there, okay. About this time, a devastating plague swept across the nation. It came in 3 waves. Each wave was more virulent, killing healthier people and killing them quicker. It swept across North and South America and around the world, killing billions. But the troops who had arrived seemed to be mostly immune to it, though a few of them died as well. Of the total population before the earthquake, I estimated that 25% died in the plague. I knew as I was flying over it that the plague had been man-made, and the troops were inoculated against it, but it took many months before the survivors of the plague realized the true source of it. I will talk more about this plague in the next chapter. The lawlessness began to ease as the martyrs were caught and summarily executed by the troops. They did not have any regard for civil rights or even human rights. They had a job to do, and they did it with brute force and little empathy, which may have been necessary in that setting, at least at first. When the troops arrived in Salt Lake City area, they were complimentary of the church and surprised at how far the relief and restoration had progressed. But as the weeks progressed, they became less and less tolerant. They started taking advantage of any chaos that existed. Because of the collapse of civil authority, the church had become the only organized group of people remaining. The church had taken charge of rebuilding and reorganizing and did not stop just because relief efforts had arrived. This was the first city the troops had entered that didn't just give up and hand control of civil matters over to the foreign troops. The organization of the church seemed to thwart their plans to be in control. In a short time, it became apparent that the primary goal was to establish their own government in place of federal and local governments. When they found the church organized and functioning as a de facto government, it frustrated their plans, and it also created a split in their ranks, largely by national origin. The few U.S. troops among them refused to act against the church, as did many from Europe. Quite a few of the troops who resisted were members themselves. The troops from Asia were not dissuaded, and thereafter decided that the church was an enemy that had to be shut down or destroyed. But they could not proceed to just destroy that church, or the church, because of the troops who did not agree, and because of the fact that they were nearly all of the remaining population were members of the church or indebted to it for their lives and welfare. A considerable amount of printed propaganda began coming from what appeared to remnants of our federal government. They proclaimed with great fanfare that this was the beginning of a new world order. They claimed that everything had changed in the world. For the time in memory, the United States was no longer able to meet its own basic needs, and the rest of the world was welcoming us into this new world. The logic they used was, why else would they be here with food and medicine instead of with guns and bombs? Our own government seemed to be urging all U.S. citizens to just submit and accept the changes in civil authority. It didn't take long for most people to decide our federal government no longer existed and that this propaganda was coming from the foreign troops themselves. The attitude of almost everyone changed from relief and acceptance to viewing these foreign troops as an invasion force. There was a huge growth of local resistance and distrust, especially in the Utah area. People saw them as having come to destroy our liberties and our church, which turned out to be true. Some people began to quietly disobey their new laws. However, those who listened to the Holy Spirit realized that resisting these troops was not the Lord's will. He had his own agenda, and those who obeyed him just watched and waited upon the Lord. The foreign troops at first waged a propaganda campaign, trying to destroy the people's trust in the church. They did this by publishing lies and accusations. They infiltrated the local meetings or paid people for information on what was going on in the local boards and stakes. They would then create some sort of uproar just to see who was loyal to the church and who would be loyal to the foreign authority. They passed laws declaring that the church had no authority in civil matters. Then they falsely accused and arrested key leaders for involving themselves in civic affairs. These were crimes against the new laws. Some of these leaders were publicly executed, which dramatically darkened the mood of the people toward the troops. In a short period of time, they effectively ejected the church from all civil matters. Since they could not tell a Mormon from anyone else just by looking at them, they made it illegal for any American to be in a position of authority in civil matters. The mood of some of the people turned rebellious, and along with the troops who had defected from the foreign forces, they moved from their homes up into the mountains. They took guns and provisions, and with them periodically attacked the foreign troops. Their efforts were poorly inspired, and they were soon killed or captured, or they melted back into the larger society. The remainder of the people quietly turned their attention to prayer and faith, and they hearkened to the leadership of the church. The church began operating quietly to accomplish the Lord's mission and did not fear the troops, but they also didn't provoke them. I never saw an official group of U.S. soldiers or National Guard. I found out later that atomic weapons had been deployed to take out major defense installations around the nation and in Utah. There had been a first strike against the United States, and it came without provocation. About this time, the same plague that had devastated so much of the East Coast arrived in Utah as it spread across the nation. The foreign troops had brought hazmat equipment as if they were expecting the plague, and a few of them got sick. As I said, we found out later that the plague was man-made, and the troops had been inoculated against the pathogen that caused the plague. The foreign troops were prepared in other ways. They had printed posters that they required everyone to fasten to the front of their door. The sign was a black circle with a diagonal line through it. Inside of a wreath, the sign had the word plague in red letters printed behind the black line. There was a row of white numbered stickers across the bottom of the poster. There were instructions on the poster. We were to put a sticker on the left side of the poster on the black line indicating how many people were alive in the home. When someone died, we were to put the number of the dead on the right side of the poster on the line. We then changed the number of the living. The stickers could be reused as needed. It was a terrifying and grieving moment when someone had to change their stickers. People often stood around the front door weeping and praying for the strength just to move the stickers. Now I'm going to show you the little picture they did. It's a picture book now, okay? So I'm going to hold it up to the camera. That's the little sticker. That's the diagram that he saw when he was flying around. Okay, that's it right there. When the troops came, they drove by each house and aimed a reader gun at the poster. The gun was attached to a laptop computer that remembered each house by its GPS location. If the numbers had changed, indicating another death, they pulled into your driveway. We were given body bags and were instructed to put our dead on the back porch or in the backyard, and they would come gather them up in the evening. When the plague was at its most deathly stage, it took days or even weeks for the trucks to make it to outlying streets. They were most concerned about controlling the city center and only left that area when all of the dead had been collected. When a person contracted the plague, they got many smallpox marks on their skin, similar to pimples. These grew in size and quantity until nearly their whole body was covered by them. They grew very sick quickly. The itching and pain was severe. Shortly before death, the pox erupted and oozed. This fluid was extremely contagious. Everyone who touched it got sick. We learned all this by sad experience. Many people who knew they were going to die zipped themselves into the body bags before the pox erupted to spare their loved ones having to handle their bodies. These were dark times. The very young and very old died first. Those who were trying to help others and became contaminated by touching the fluid died next. The plague ultimately killed more than half of those who were exposed to it. Some people survived by natural immunity or divine intervention. Once symptoms appeared, a person would die about 12 hours later. The plague came in 3 waves, each one taking out the next weakest group of people. If you got sick and somehow survived, you became immune. The soldiers who handled the dead were dressed in white contamination suits. They took away the bodies of the dead to parks or football stadiums where they had dug large holes. The dead were then soaked with fuel and cremated. The troops did not speak to us since most of them did not speak English. They were detached and unsympathetic. They just had a nasty job to do, which they were determined to accomplish without contaminating themselves or becoming insane from so much death. They also didn't harass us. It was all impersonal. When I had earlier seen these scenes, while flying across the landscape, I saw city after city across the nation where these posters were on the doors. I didn't understand what they meant until I saw this latter part of the vision, where I was on the ground experiencing it as a living person. I was left with the impression that between the earthquake and the plague, more than half of the population had been killed, more on the coastlines and fewer inland. The scene became more and more horrendous as I watched time pass. In Utah and other places where people had hearkened to the warnings to store food and prepare spiritually, there was hope. In other places, people lost hope. Some people intentionally contaminated themselves with the plague after watching loved ones die. In places where people had no hope, awful things happened that I think it best not to articulate. Suffice it to say that heinous crimes were commonplace. In a heavily populated area, starvation and thirst drove people to do the unthinkable, fulfilling many prophecies of these times that Christ had referred to as the abomination of desolations. Civilization came to a standstill to await the end of all life, and people despaired aloud, saying that Jesus Christ was delaying his coming until after the end of all life on earth. Anywhere the church was prevalent, the people were much better off because of the preparations of the people and of the church. Food and water were still available. Large meals were prepared and served in public places, most often churches. People had at least one sustaining meal a day. Many came with more food than they ate, sustaining their relief effort and calming people's fears. Nobody was turned away. We divided what we had with everyone. As long as the church didn't take any part in civic decisions, the foreign troops allowed these efforts and contributed to the food that was served. Churches, LDS, and others were divided off into family living quarters. The troops brought in water in large tanker trucks. Water was rationed, but it was plentiful. The food was simple. I didn't see much meat. It was mostly stored food from local people and the church. If someone grew ill, there was a protocol for a local doctor or nurse to certify that you did not have the plague, and then the foreign troops would take you to the larger hospitals. The troops continued to assert greater and greater control, including establishing martial law and suspending civil liberties. The enforcement of their new laws was either by a warning, refusing further food and services to your family, or by execution. They did not maintain jails. It was about this time that the plague hit Europe, Asia, and Africa. I don't believe it was ever started there or intended to go there, but it got out of control and crossed the oceans. The devastation there was far more severe than here than in the Americas. The result over time was a complete collapse of society. We also heard of great natural disasters now taking place all over the world. There were hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, and disease. This was the time period when the landmass arose in the Gulf and the tidal wave swept northward. Initially, America had been the hardest hit by all of this, but when the destructions hit the nations who had released the plague and launched the nuclear weapons, it was far more destructive for them. Their entire governments, financial institutions, and economics collapsed. They experienced powerful earthquakes and continental movement, and rioting and war were far more devastating than in America. People were trying to leave those continents in droves. As I will explain more fully later, angels and translated beings ministered in the worthy and faithful and protected them as they began their journey to Zion. Now we're going to stop there because it goes into a different section here, and this is a good place because I've got a lot of thoughts on this. So this was a very vivid passage that we read, right? And my first thought is, well, first of all, remember if you watched the documentary, and we're talking about Ruby Frankie now, how Kevin was like, yeah, we were totally like into that. We really believed like seeing all these natural disasters, that the second coming was on the way, this, that, and the other. I mean, literally all. Now, here's the other thing too. Even just as they're reading this, I'm thinking COVID. I'm thinking like so much stuff going on could be viewed through the lens of like see. And I don't know what this is, whether it's a psychological term or whatever you call it, where you find stuff to fit. So it's like, because I believe this, I'll find things to make that true in my reality. You see what I'm saying? So for example, if I'm 100% like a plague will wipe out humanity, like that is my core belief. I'm not saying that's mine, but you get what I'm saying. And then COVID comes along, bam, bam, there you go. I told you so. You know what I mean? That was the vibe I was getting from this. Now let's circle back around, people. Let's loop it back. Okay. Looking through the lens of Jody, Ruby, Lori, all them. This was probably, when I say the best passage, I know you're like, Paul, that's horrible. It was such a dark, thing. This gave me so much insight into their thinking, right? This was probably the most insightful passage we have read in this so far, to me at least, right? Because I'm like, okay, wait a minute. This explains so much going on. And again, for people like, and I just call them narcissistic, like whether it's religious narcissism, I don't know if there's a certain thing for it, but whatever has just gotten a hold of people like Ruby and Jody and Lori and Chad and whatnot. This right here, I'm just like, imagine somebody who's like them reading something like this where it's like, oh yeah, all this is going to happen and blah, 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 and them wanting to be the translator of that information and them being like, yep, see, only the church is going to survive and this, that, and the other. We're going to be, for Lori and Chad, we're going to be the leaders. We're going to be this, we're going to be that. Yet we've stored our food. We did this. In this, there was like this sense of like, because we prepared and we were doing this and we shared with everyone we did that, like that's a nice thought, right? But then if you filter that through somebody like Ruby and Jody and all them, I'm like, no, that's where you get into people who are utilizing it as like a power move. It's not done with authenticity. So for them, if the situation really came up, they would completely abuse it. And you know what also this completely made me think of? And y'all are like, really, Paul? Okay, so like the series Walking Dead, if you're not familiar with it, it's like a zombie show that was real popular. And they would go from town to town, and some towns it would end up in, like, obviously zombies have wiped out. That was the plague, if you will, right? And society has crumbled and it's rebuilding, whatever. And you'll go to some towns where it's like, oh, this is weird. They've created this insular town in the midst of destruction outside. Yay, we can get comfortable and happy. And then they start seeing the workings of the town, and most of the time it's run by some evil person or whatever. This to me was giving that kind of a vibe. And also in that, I would think that Lori, Chad, Jody, Ruby would be the evil, sinister ones behind this fake facade, because that's what they were doing anyways, right? Especially Ruby and Jody with the podcast and this and that. Now Lori and Chad, maybe amongst their own little clique, they were trying to do that, but it quickly fell apart to just pure evil. Anyways, let me know what you think about this. I'm very curious. Finally, more than halfway in, I'm like, and now we're getting somewhere with this, right? Now we're getting to some explanation. I mean, we've gotten it before, but this was just very eye-opening to me. So that's it. Let me know in the comment section. I appreciate you for watching. While you're in the comment section, please drop off sofas for Rosco and Spirit, Bo and Luke, myself, and the rest of the Sofa Squad, so we can get through this book together. Okay. And look, in the meantime, until we all gather around in the comment section, I'll see y'all there. I just wanted to say thank you again for watching the whole video, and also thank you for being part of the Sofa Squad. Special thanks to all the Patreon members, channel members from both of my channels, everybody who likes, shares, subscribes, comments in the comment sections. It helps the channel out so much. Now, don't forget, I do have that other channel, the podcast channel. That's where we go live, we hang out, we talk. We have kind of sort of a schedule, but just be sure and check it out. I'll put it up here on the screen. And then, like I said in the beginning of the video, if you want to follow me and Rosco on the Instagram, go on, check it out. It's right here on the screen again. But once again, thank you very much. I really appreciate you being part of the Sofa Squad, and I'll see you in the next video.